If you were in this situation and you just treated life as an experiment, right, where the consequences of what you didn't really matter because it would just be reset anyway, even if you died, if you were in this situation, what identities would you try on? Who would you be just as an experiment? Hi, I'm Gabriel from GabrielSeanWallace.com, and this is Identity Coaching with Movies, the podcast where we use movies as coaching tools. I'm an identity coach, which means that I help you to rediscover, reconnect, and recreate your identity from the inside out. And in this podcast, we use movies as the magnificent tools they are for identity coaching. In this episode, we are using the movie Groundhog Day to look at creating life purpose. This is episode number 1 of Identity Coaching with Movies. And I'm so wildly pumped to begin this journey and to begin with one of my all-time favorite movies, Harold Ramis's Groundhog Day, starring Bill Murray and Andie MacDowell, released in 1993. Keep listening to the whole podcast to learn why Ned Ryerson is the devil, a great quote that Confucius did not say, and how Carl Jung could have predicted there would be 6 more weeks of winter. Now, if you'd like the identity worksheet that supplements this movie and this podcast, and I do recommend that, go to my website at GabrielSeanWallace.com and you will see an option to access all my identity worksheets from every episode of this podcast. Enter your email and get instant free access to all of those worksheets and all future worksheets. So that's GabrielSeanWallace.com. It's in the show notes, but I'll spell it here for you just in case. GabrielSeanWallace.com. Okay, now, because this is podcast episode 1, I do just want to clarify what my intention is with this podcast, because you might be thinking, hey, so I get the movies part. What's all this identity coaching stuff? And I get that. Or maybe you know a little about coaching, whether it's life coaching or mindset coaching or spiritual coaching or something similar, and you're wondering how I can be talking about movies. And I get that too. So let me just take a minute to explain the concept of this podcast, Identity Coaching with Movies. Firstly, full disclosure, I am creating this podcast first and foremost as a resource for my clients. I am an identity coach, which means that people come to me when they face what is generally called an identity crisis, right? It could be that you've lost sense of who you are, or you're stuck in some life situation and you don't know who you need to become to make that right transition, or you're really trying to find your life purpose, or you feel torn between 2 paths and you don't know which way to choose because you haven't connected strongly enough with that deepest, truest part of yourself. Or even that you've got a great life, but you get no fulfillment out of it because you feel hollow inside or detached from who you are. I've had so many clients with a vast array of identity issues, and it's really opened my eyes to just how many people are struggling with their identity. So, the movies part, what's that? So, this is a podcast that focuses not on the production aspects of a movie. This is not a movie review podcast. This is not a movie critique podcast. This is not even merely a deep analysis of the movie, although it is that to the degree that we require for the work we're doing. What I do essentially in this podcast is something I've done with a lot of my clients. We apply the film as a tool for personal development, for identity work. Because art is the original personal development tool. Did you know that? Before there were coaches, before there were motivational speakers, before there was psychotherapy, before there was, dare I say it, even religion, there was art. Now, I didn't say before there was God, okay? But I said before religion, there was art. You see, art and mind have a special channel of interaction. And when the mind is conscious enough to receive the wisdom of art, then it may allow itself to be transformed by it. One's very identity can be transcended and transformed through the power of art. People have been using art for what I call identity work for millennia. They were using it in caves, for goodness sakes, right? And when I say art, I include stories, by the way. Storytelling is art. When we immerse ourselves in a story, our minds are compelled to insert ourselves into that story, which inevitably alters our consciousness and the perspective we have of our own world. The world that we return to once we depart from the story, right? Whether people admit it to themselves or not, that's the case. And so the deeper you can comprehend a story, the deeper you feel into a story, the deeper you can comprehend and feel into yourself. See, what we're interested in is the deeper truth within the art. And now we have this marvelous new art form accessible to millions, billions of people. And it's called film. Yet the true value that it offers has been lost on our generation of viewers. Lost to the glorification of film as entertainment only. Lost to the passive viewing of film rather than the active viewing of it. When I say active viewing, I mean that to truly reap the rewards of art, any art, storytelling, film, any art, you must enter into an interaction with it. Did you know that with film, you can explore your unconscious mind? You can confront fears. You can rekindle long-held dreams. You can ask deep questions of yourself. And you can expand who you are. It's ridiculous what is possible with film. And most people just don't know how to do that. And that's a tragedy. And so I feel compelled to do my part to help fill that cavity in our society. So, Groundhog Day. Right? This is a timeless classic, if you'll excuse the pun. And in my opinion, one of the best expressions of philosophy that the medium of film has ever produced. And it provides a plethora of deep investigations for you in your identity work. I've used this film with several of my clients, and I think it's a wonderful way to snip the ribbon, if you will, to mark the beginning of this podcast. So if you have not seen the film, I highly encourage you to pause this podcast right now and go watch the movie, because there will be spoilers, and you will gain a lot more from this podcast by having watched the film already. So I'll assume throughout the rest of this podcast that you've watched the whole movie, okay? So in Groundhog Day, Phil Connors, this is the character that Bill Murray plays, is a sardonic and cynical weatherman from Pittsburgh, and he's assigned to go to Punxsutawney for Groundhog Day to cover this event, this real event in the USA called Groundhog Day, which is every February 2nd, right? It's the day where they pull out the groundhog and they pretend that the groundhog whispers into their ears and says whether or not it sees a shadow. It saw a shadow when it woke up this morning. And if the answer is yes, then there will be 6 more weeks of winter. But if the answer is no, then it'll be an early spring. Right, so Phil Connors goes and he covers this event, and he can't wait for it to end. And he tries to leave Punxsutawney on February 2nd, but a blizzard traps him in there. So he stays another night. But when he wakes up again, it's Groundhog Day again. He's entered a time loop. Or I've seen it called online a localized temporal anomaly. And I would like to add another term. I would say that it would seem as if he's fallen into a time ditch, actually, right? He's fallen into this time ditch that he just can't get out of, no matter what he does. So it goes on and on and on and on. He keeps waking up at 6 a.m. on Groundhog Day. We don't know exactly for how long, but for a long time. And during this time, he has feelings for his producer, Rita, and part of his own private eternity is spent pursuing her. And eventually, he does wake up on February 3rd as an entirely transformed man. So that's the synopsis, just to remind you, in case it's been a while since you've seen the film, okay? And in this podcast, we don't go scene by scene, we go theme by theme, all right? So I will be using this movie, Groundhog Day, as a launching pad for identity coaching, and we're going to look at 5 themes. And the 5 themes are: number 1, existential thoughts; number 2, Sisyphus and purpose, okay, as in the myth of Sisyphus; number 3, rituals and Confucius; number 4, stages of grief and loss; and number 5, integrating your shadow. And you want to stick around for that, because that is the one that really is the keystone to all of it. Okay, so if you're really looking to get something out of it, then you need to stick around for integrating your shadow. I don't know how long this podcast is going to be. I've got a lot of notes, but let's see. So number 1, existential thoughts. Now I'd like to ask you 3 questions, and I'd like for you to answer them to yourself. These questions are on the downloadable worksheet that you can get from my website, and this is where you're really going to get something out of this podcast. Okay, so really try doing this. So question 1, what would you do if you had just one day left to live? Forget about the time loop, okay? Forget about that for a minute. Just if someone told you that you're terminally ill and you only have one day left to live, what do you do? Because you know what? Could happen, right? You don't know. Question 2, what would you do if you could live forever? So if you were immortal, what would you do? How would you live? How would you live differently from the way you're living now? And question number 3, why do you think the time loop in this movie eventually stopped? Okay, what eventually stopped it? What's your opinion on that? Okay, now I'd like you to really consider your answers to these questions sincerely. So pause the podcast if you need to. Write down your responses if you want, either on your worksheet or just on paper, because it may be valuable for you to go back to these questions at the end of the podcast. Okay? All right. So, assuming you've done that, you know all the work I do with my clients are completely confidential, right? But I can tell you that I've heard quite a bit of variety when it comes to these questions. So the first question, what would you do if you had just one day left to live? I've heard, of course, spend the day with my family, spend the day with someone special, tell someone how much I love them, right? Make sure they are okay. Make sure everything was prepared for my funeral. Make sure all of my taxes are done, right? Make sure my will is in place. One client even told me about how they would divide the day into 3 parts, right? Into activities they like doing, then obligations that they had to complete, and then in the final third of the day would be to do with relationships, spending the day with the people that were most important to them. But what about you? What about you? Good to plan these things. So question 2 was, what would you do if you were immortal? And clients also have given me answers like learn new things, right? Such as languages, musical instruments, martial arts. Okay, they would learn all of these things, travel the world, invent something, become an artist, right? They would like to perfect an art form like painting or maybe writing or photography. And also I've heard reach enlightenment. Isn't it fascinating how many people think that because we live in this purgatory between these 2 extremes, that those things are off the table? That we don't need to do the things that we would do if we just had one day left to live because we have a long time left. And we don't bother to do the things that we would do if we could live forever because we just don't have long enough. And so instead, people settle for a sort of survive the next month regime, right? But what if you did embrace some of these things into your life? Could you? How would that change your life if you did embrace some of these things? That could be revealing. Now, I'd like to continue this section with some thought experiments as a way to open your mind to some of the concepts, ideas, perspectives I'll be offering you throughout this podcast. And it's just, keep that in mind. They are offers, okay? None of this is anything that you have to take. I'm not saying that you have to agree with me on anything here. These are all offerings. So, Harold Ramis, the writer and director, has said that the kernel of this film came with a question that he found fascinating, which, by the way, is how many investigations into identity begin. Fascinating question. And his question was, could immortality force someone who seems unable to change to finally change? That was his question. So that's something that you can think about for yourself. So pick something that you're not too proud of in your life. Could be anything. Maybe a bad habit, maybe something you do, anything. Just pick something you're not proud of. And something you think will never change, all right? So it's something that you're not too proud of and you don't think is ever going to change about yourself. Maybe it's just one of these beliefs you have that that's just how I am. What if you had forever to change it? How long is it going to take? How long does it take for you to change if you had forever? And how might you shorten that time? Now, you might be thinking of ideas now about how you might be able to change that thing that you thought you couldn't change, but that you actually can change, right? If you had forever. And then maybe you can also start to think about how if you had even just one day, how forever can sometimes shorten into just a day. What if you had just one day? Could you change it then? Because you know that we all live just day by day anyway, and you know that identity change can happen in an instant. Just a thought. Let's go to another thought experiment. So, this is something that I found pretty interesting. How long would it take Phil for him to forget that there was ever any other reality at all? How long would it take for him to not even be able to recall a time when he was not in this loop? Now, before you say, well, of course that's not going to happen, because let's say he was 40 years old before he entered this ditch, right? Before he fell into this time ditch. Let's say he was 40 years old. Okay. What if he got stuck in this ditch or this loop, whatever you want to call it, and he was stuck there for 1,000,000 years? 1,000,000 years of just living the same day over and over and over again. Because remember, he can't die. Every time he dies in the movie, time just resets for him. He goes back to the beginning, like a video game, right? So, what if he goes for 1,000,000 years? Is that 40 years? That first 40 years of his life? Is he going to truly have any memories of that anymore? Or will he just take it for granted that this is life? You know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of these tragic occasions when very young people are sentenced to life in prison, right? You get a 17-year-old who commits, let's say he commits murder, and he's sentenced to life at 17. Well, then he lives his whole life in prison, and then he gets to his 70s, let's say. He can barely comprehend the reality of outside prison life that he had before he went into prison, right? It's so distant, such a distant past that it's like a fantasy now, right? And besides, we remember what is relevant to us. So for Phil, stuck in this time loop, Groundhog Day, if he lives like that for 1,000,000 years, what is relevant about anything that came before Groundhog Day? There's nothing relevant about it anymore. It becomes like his own private myth or legend that before Groundhog Day, there was a time outside of this time, right? It would become like a private dream, a private myth, long since forgotten. So what's the point of all this? What am I really getting at with this thought experiment? Well, what might you have forgotten? And what might we have forgotten as humanity? What if, just go with me on this for a second. What if we've been confined to our physical bodies for so long as humanity, that we've been confined to these physical bodies for so long that we've forgotten how boundless we truly are, and that this bag of bones is just like a ditch that we have gotten ourselves stuck in? What if we used to be, at one distant time in the past, we used to be boundless or free of physical entrapments? Now, I'm not saying that that's true. I'm just trying to open your minds to that possibility. Is your mind opening yet? So, in the movie, all the universe and all of metaphysics has turned its attention to him, right? It's all enfolded on him. Think about that, because it's not just Punxsutawney, right, that's going round and round this time loop. No. Because the weather's the same, the climate is the same, right? And he was watching Jeopardy on TV at one point, right? It's not just that he's in a bubble. It's not like a bubble and everything outside is still going on. No. The entire universe and all of metaphysics has adapted for him. As far as we know, no one else outside of himself is going through this same experience. Maybe they are, right? Maybe that's just something we don't know about as the viewers of this movie. But as far as we know, it's all because of him. And what's relevant about this is that all the universe and all of metaphysics does indeed gravitate its attention to you. Now, you don't have a time loop, maybe, but it's gravitated to you through your consciousness, right? You do not experience life through the eyes of another, not ordinarily. You experience life through your physical body and your temporal body, your energetic body. The very truth that you experience the universe through a concentrated vacuum of space, time, energy, that it's funneled through you and you experience it as you, demonstrates to you that you are, at the very least, special to the universe, and perhaps even you are the present consciousness or the present center of consciousness of the universe itself. Just a thought, something to think about. Now, the next bit is, what about Phil's isolation that he feels from the rest of the world? Right? Because he does, right? He feels tremendously isolated because everyone else is just treating Groundhog Day as another day, whereas he is the only one in his reality that experiences the day as a loop, right? So he, of course, at first responds to this in kind of an arrogant way. Like, he's smarter than everyone. He knows something that everyone else does not, right? So how can you act when you feel separate from everyone else? When they don't understand you. They don't understand what you do. The thing is, right, that you are the only one who experiences the world as you do. Nobody does understand what you understand, which is how it feels to be you. How it feels to wake up with your memories in your body and have your perspective. Nobody understands that better than you. Kind of like how you can never know for sure that someone experiences the color blue in the same way as you do, right? But Phil takes it personally, right? So how does this affect the way you show up in the world? Because you know what? You don't know how it is to be someone else either. And that's Phil's limitation too. See, Phil doesn't get that at first. He feels like he knows everything and he's smarter than everyone. But I think that he finally accepts that he does not create the weather, and he cannot get ahead of the weather, and he cannot manipulate everything, and cannot control who dies and who lives, right? Now, we'll get into all of that later, but it's when he realizes that he finally grows up, if you will. So that is also just a thought experiment, just throwing that out there. Now, the next one is This comes from a very interesting article I read related to Groundhog Day in Transparency Now. It's a journal or a website. It's a website online. And I want to read you some of this, what it says, because it is quite interesting. And then I've got some questions for you. So it says, the timeless middle of the movie has some of the characteristics of a virtual world in which Murray can experiment with alternative ways of living and being. In that, it is like forms of fiction, including imagination. Since he participates in this virtual world, perhaps it is most like participatory fictions, MUDs, video games, virtual realities. The movie similarly seeks to be our timeless interlude in which we can try on different ways of living. Okay, end quote for now. So let me interrupt. Now, it's very interesting, right? Because even though back then we didn't have virtual reality in the same way we have it now, you can see that there are a lot of similarities there. And, you know, when he dies, for example, the most obvious example, when he dies, it's just reset, right? Reset back to the beginning of the day again. So what I would like to ask you is, if you were in this situation and you just treated life as an experiment, right, where the consequences of what you did didn't really matter because it would just be reset anyway, even if you died, if you were in this situation, what identities would you try on? Who would you be just as an experiment? I want you to think about that and answer it. Write it down if you want. Pause if you want and write it down. What identities would you try on, and who would you be just as an experiment? So let me continue the article. So, quote, Sherry Turkle of MIT, whose work is discussed in an essay in The Age of Simulation, sees MUDs, or text-based interactive fictional worlds on the internet, such as a virtual world, allowing one to try on different selves. But she believes that they, and other participatory forms of fiction, allow us to discover that we are many selves, all of which turn out to be fictions. In Turkle's view, life is a kind of game, a form of theater, and the fiction in stories isn't much different than the fiction of life. This is still the article. It says, I believe the correct conclusion is precisely the opposite. Fiction, whether participatory or vicarious, allows us to identify with and play characters who find their true selves, thereby putting us in touch with the universal human nature in each of us. The ability to watch and play the role of fictional characters makes the fiction more interesting and expands our vision of possible ways of being. But, one way or another, it must lead us back to our true selves, the universal moral being we all, or most of us, are, which is as real as the physical world is real. In fact, the movie symbolizes just this, since Murray's character treats his life as a game only when he is in despair. Once he has a sense of hope, he becomes more authentic and discovers himself. End quote. I love this. It expounds on narrative psychology, which I use a lot of in my coaching, and it demolishes a misconception that some people might have about using fiction in identity work, Some objections are that it's just fantasy and fiction, right? But the truth is that this practice of role-playing or trying on fictional personalities, if done well and with appropriate instructional guidance, can uncover a lot of latent truth that's been hiding within us for a long time. It can show you parts of yourself that you might have forgotten about or never even known existed. The fact is that the fact is created from fiction, not the other way around, as some people would have you believe. So, this idea of resetting the self, it's interesting because you can do this with imagination, right? We all do this. We all do it when we are projecting ourselves into the future and thinking, well, if I did this, would that happen? Would this happen? Or what if I did that other thing? Then maybe that would lead to this, and then, and then I would be happier, and then blah, 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 right? We all do this. But what if you did it more actively? What if you did it more consciously? You see, a lot of people do it in this unconscious sort of way, which isn't always helpful. What if we consciously said, okay, let me use my imagination now to go through these potential futures in my mind and act these potential futures out in my mind. That's what we can use this idea of Groundhog Day for, right? With our inside our imagination, we cannot die. I mean, we don't die. We die maybe in our imagination when we're thinking about what if, this is very helpful. Like, what if I drove off this cliff, right? You don't want to do that because then you die, and you, in your imagination, you do it and you die. But then back to reality, you'll reset. You haven't done that thing. Thank goodness, right? So the imagination is good for this, and we can use it if you know how to harness your imagination properly. You can use it to put yourself into situations as if you were living in a game, right? And by the way, we do this with our past too. It's funny because when this movie came out, a lot of psychoanalysts, I should say, they went to Harold Ramis and said, well, we know this movie is about psychoanalysis because, well, we tend to go through the same stories in our minds over and over and over again, right? And the same issues come up before us over and over and over again until we finally solve that issue, right? This is what psychoanalysis is for. And so that is done with our past, and we can reframe those stories. And reframing is a big part of coaching, especially identity coaching, right? Reframing our life narrative, because our past is largely a fiction which we edit, believe it or not, right? And it's funny, there's actually a sign in Groundhog Day. If you see when he's walking out onto the street and he walks past the old man in green, there's a sign behind him that says frames. And I think this is a little nod to reframing. And just sticking with this idea of the video games, right, and the virtual reality, it just reminded me of something that Dr. Jordan Peterson has spoken about, and that's this idea of meta games. So when a kid is learning how to play games when they're growing up, right? They're playing sports, they're playing board games, classroom games, all of these games. They start to learn after a while that it's not the winning of the single game that is important, but rather the meta game that they're playing, right? Because how you take a loss and how you play the game, that actually affects your social life, right? And so this is more of a meta game, social life. And there's more to it than just the social game, but it often is seen as the social game, right? The meta game is the social game. And so Phil in the movie is playing these games, right? He's able to rob a bank. He's able to sleep with Nancy, right? He does all these things. He's playing all these games and he's winning these little games. But soon he realizes that he's losing the meta game because he's not fulfilled by winning all these little games. So what is the meta game here? And how does he win? The meta game is often thought of as a social game, right? But what about the meta game? Is the meta game an inner game? A game of fulfillment in life? What would that be for you? How are you sabotaging your own meta game? If you had to really think about it, how are you sabotaging your meta game? All right, so that's where religion takes the stage, okay? And I've read online, unfortunately, that a lot of people call this a very secular film because he never goes to see a holy man, right? And that's a good point. He goes to see the doctor and the psychiatrist, but he never does go to see a priest or even talk about that. And the only religious symbol we see in the movie is the church when he's jumping off the church, right? That's the only thing we see. But I would suggest that the entirety of the experience in itself is a religious experience. Or if you don't want to say a religious experience, a spiritual experience. Right? It's basically even a psychedelic experience. It's like a DMT trip juxtaposed onto a frost-bitten winter, right? Only that the psychedelia has been anesthetized by the winter, which is ultimately coming from his own heart, right? The winter it's like the blizzard is coming from his heart. And it's like a chill that has numbed and dulled all of the phantasmagoria of the trip. So all that remains of the trip is the experience of the horror of having been caught in this trap on the topology of time, right? So he is having an experience that is divine in some way. And we can also observe this when, he's saying things like, I make the weather, right? And he talks in the cafe about how he is a god, right? And eventually, as he matures, he is acknowledging his own limitations and he's reading the book that is referencing God. He's reading the poem called Trees by Joyce Kilmer. He's reading that poem to Rita, and he says, I think, well, he doesn't say this actually in the movie, but this is in the poem. It says, I think I shall never see a poem as lovely as a tree. Poems are made by fools like me, but only God can make a tree. And he says, he does say the final line, only God can make a tree. So this is a reference, okay? And it's not an overt religious symbol, but it's there. Also, sticking with Christianity for now, and the Western tradition, at least, maybe not, you can argue whether it's Christian or not, but what if Punxsutawney is purgatory? Punxsutawney, purgatory, right? And they drive over the bridge to the other world at the beginning. They're driving over a bridge to get there. Bridge to purgatory, bridge to Punxsutawney. And I mean, it is a purgatory, right? A purgatory between his past and his future. He's in this nowhere land. And it's in the middle of nowhere to him, right? Because he comes from a city, Pittsburgh, and he's in this little town in the middle of nowhere as he sees it. So for him, it's purgatory. And what if Ned is the devil? Ned Ryerson. Have you heard this theory online? There's some of this on the internet, that Ned Ryerson is actually the devil. And you can see when he first approaches Phil, he calls himself Ned the Bull, and he's using that little hand gesture that looks like the devil and the devil's horns, right? And he is trying to sell life insurance to Phil, and eventually Phil buys, right? This is, some people have said this is similar to a selling of the soul or whatever. I don't really look at it in that way. I feel that Phil has, well, the thing is that's when he gets out, right? On the last day, we hear that, oh, Phil bought all my life insurance and it's the happiest day of my life, right? And then the next day, he exits the time loop, the time ditch. So there's maybe a connection there. But I would say that it's not really because he purchased the life insurance, but rather because he invested in his life as it was. And that the purchase was just a natural consequence of that investment of his life. And what really got him out, maybe, just my idea, but maybe, was that he invested in his own life, in his own spirit. And that investment eventually got him out of the ditch, right? Just my theory. So Ned also says, "Oh God, it is so good to see you. Oh God." So there's this idea, again, because Phil's calling himself a god, there's God and the devil, right? So there's this, but there's also the theory, I don't know if they're related or combined or what, but there's also the theory that Ned is in his own time loop. And this is one that I can definitely get behind, because there's a lot of evidence for this in the movie. When he first approaches Phil on that day one, he mentions Phil's high school. I don't remember the name of it now, but he mentions Phil's high school. He says the name of Phil's sister, and Phil doesn't refute it. He knows all about Phil, despite Phil not remembering him at all. So what if Ned had found out that information in his own time loop? And that Ned's mission to get out of his time loop is to sell this insurance. So in that sense, Phil is like in a loop within a loop within a loop. Who knows how many loops there are, right? Now that'll get you thinking. So then I think it's also very relevant that when he first looks out of the window on day 2 of Groundhog Day, the second time, right? The first time when he's experiencing it as a loop and he's realizing that he's in a loop, the first thing he says is, "What the hell? What the hell?" And you know what this reminded me of? Because this is such an existential movie, it reminded me of the great existential philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre and his play No Exit, which I read like back when I was a teenager, and I loved it. And in this play, you get 3 people together in a room. They have to spend eternity together, and that is hell for them. Right? That is hell. They've died and they've gone to hell. And their hell is spending eternity together in this room, in this mismatch of personalities. And in this play, he says, hell is other people. And we already know that Phil is a misanthrope, right? He doesn't like other people. We know this by now. And so this was a nod to Sartre. I'm sure of it. So that was interesting. And we will get back to pure existentialism in a couple of minutes. But I do want to go on with the other religions. So there's also a nod to Buddhism, right? There's the famous story of how the Buddha, he grew up all privileged in this palace, right? And then someone takes him out, a servant takes him out of the palace, and he learns the truth of old age, sickness, and death in that order. Now, what does Phil do? He comes across that old man, and first we see that he's old, the old man, and then we see that the old man is sick, and then we see the old man die. And so Phil is exposed to this old age, sickness, and death, just like the Buddha was. There's Hinduism and the cycle of death and rebirth, right? Many Hindus, when this film came out, they believed that the film was a metaphor for samsara and reincarnation. That we live in this perpetual cycle of suffering until you can transcend the cycle by the extinction of desire and ignorance and all impurities of the spirit, right? And so Phil does eventually transcend this, right? He transcends this cycle when he stops desiring to have sex with Rita. She says at the end, like, oh, you just fell asleep when I came home and I was ready for... She basically says she was going to have sex with him and he didn't want to and he fell asleep, right? And then so he transcended his desire. And maybe that's what got him out. And you know, I also read another fascinating article on this in Psychology Today. And so I'll quote you a little quote here. It says, so what if similar to Groundhog Day, one explanation of what occurs after we pass is we repeat the cycle of life. In this way, life is like school. If we perform exceptionally well in our courses, we go on to graduate. But if we fail, we have to repeat our classes again. End quote. So, interesting, huh? So, if you were to treat your life this way, how would that change the way you live? You know, there is, in my next episode, my next podcast will be about the movie Life is Beautiful. And in it, I discuss the book Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And in that book, Viktor Frankl talks about the main principle, the primary principle of logotherapy. And that is that you imagine that you have already lived your life, or you have already lived today, and you are living it now for the second time. You are getting a second chance. The first time you screwed something up. Okay, you screwed something up the first time, and now you're getting a second chance. Now, how do you live your day differently, knowing that this is your second chance? Right? How many times have you heard someone say, if only I could have a second chance, I would kill for a second chance, right? Well, if that is something that people really want, why not just live your life as if it is your second chance already? You know, what I sometimes do is if I read about history and I read about something really silly that someone has done in history, right? I'll read about something that someone did back in the 17th century or something, and I'll think to myself, you know, how silly is that? Like, why couldn't they just think like, oh, how this would have affected us today? Like, why was he tempted by that, right? Like, didn't he know that in the long run, his little temptation or his little addiction meant nothing, and that now what he didn't do would have helped us? Right, just an example. And why not think about your life that way? Project yourself 100 or 200 years from now and think, well, what would be the right decision for me to make today? Knowing that in the long run, none of my temptations, none of my little addictions are going to mean anything to anyone. But if I pursued my life purpose, now that might have an effect on someone 200 years from now. We don't know, right? Something to think about again. Now, what about, this theory of this cycle of death and rebirth is also very similar to Nietzsche's theory of eternal recurrence. Now, what's that? That is basically the theory that we have lived this exact life an infinite number of times in the past, and we will do so an infinite number of times in the future. And so it just keeps happening again and again and again, and there's nothing we can do to change it. And that we make the exact same decisions over and over and over again. Now, people online I've seen said that Phil is not in Nietzsche's theory of eternal recurrence because he can change what he does every cycle. Yes, right. But for everyone else, right? For everyone but the exceptional Phil Connors, they are experiencing precisely Nietzsche's eternal recurrence. So, take yourself out of Phil's shoes for a moment and put yourself into the shoes of one of the other people in Punxsutawney. And imagine that Phil is going to keep seeing you do and say the exact same thing every single day for years and years and years. How stupid would you look if you said if you did something stupid every day in his eyes forever? Now, I'm not trying to make you self-conscious, but when I say stupid, doing something stupid, I mean doing something that you wouldn't be proud of. Okay? So you have a choice to do something and you choose something that you know is not true to your highest self. Then, maybe if eternal recurrence is true, you just keep making that same mistake over and over again. So the question I have for you is, how would you live life differently if you knew that you would make the same decisions over and over and over again for eternity? That question, I remember, is posed to us at the end of K-Pax also. But it's a very good question to ask yourself. So take some time with that if you need. Now, the moment of, for Nietzsche, the sublime moment, the seminal moment, when a person can look at his or her own life and, no matter what it is, find within themselves the desire to never be freed from any aspect of it. When this happens, the human being transforms into the Übermensch, the Superman, the Uberman, the supreme life affirmer for Nietzsche. When you fully embrace your reality, that is when you are greater than the chains of life. See, the key to life is that you are limited. You are born into a body in which you have limited decree over, with 2 arms, 2 legs, a certain gender, a certain sexuality, certain circumstances, etc., right? So life is not just about doing what you want. The beauty of life is that you are limited, but that you have the freedom to define for yourself what responsibilities you wish to take on in life. It's the fulfillment of your own responsibilities that makes up the purpose of life. Problems occur when you betray that self-determined responsibility. Self-given responsibility. You create your own law. You have the freedom to do that. You have limitations, but you can create your own law, i.e., how you live your life. But if you break your law, then you keep yourself a prisoner. That's the deal. You are your own court, your own judge, and you are your own prison system. So you better be careful when you make your own laws. And you better be careful when you break them. So Phil essentially puts himself in prison by doing something that deep down he knows is the wrong thing, right? It's the choices in and of themselves that give our lives meaning, not the consequences of them. This is for Nietzsche. For Nietzsche, it's the choices that you make that give your life meaning and give you fulfillment, not the consequences of your choices. And so, Phil transcends the cycle of eternal recurrence through awakening to the context that he gives his own life. It's all the same, but he changes the context for himself, and he gives his life meaning. All right, so let's move on finally to number 2. That was all number 1, okay? That was all theme 1. That was all existential thoughts. Wow, I talk a lot. All right, so number 2, Sisyphus and purpose. The myth of Sisyphus. What is this? This is the Greek myth that says that Sisyphus was sentenced by the gods to spend every day for eternity rolling a big rock up a hill, only to have it pushed back down again at the end of the day so he could do the same futile, so-called futile, task again the next day. And some people would say that this is a metaphor for humans, that we do the same things every day. There are a number of perspectives on this myth, but in 1942, Camus, the existentialist Camus, came along with a book called The Myth of Sisyphus and said that we have to imagine Sisyphus happy rolling up this rock every day, that it's not miserable for him. Life itself is a macrocosm of the life of Sisyphus, and self-evidently, many of us learn to be happy. And he's happy, and I'll quote you a little quote from his book in 1942. So he says, quote, "Each atom of that stone, each mineral flake of that night-filled mountain, in itself forms a world. The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy." Okay, so complete recontextualization of this myth. And now there's a great article online called "Imagining Sisyphus Happy, a Groundhog Day Retrospective." And it's by someone called Ali Arikan. And I'll just give you a quick quote here. He says, "Phil doesn't have any guide but himself. He has to figure out the lesson without celestial counsel. Phil Connors is the modern-day Sisyphus, sequaciously rolling his boulder with the greatest effort and greatest trepidation to the very peak of the mountain, only for the gods to wish it down once again to the bottom. Groundhog Day is the only Hollywood film, hell, the only film in the history of cinema. Not even Buñuel's The Exterminating Angel comes close to delve into the abyss of Camus' absurdist nightmare, or dream, I suppose." End quote. So, this shows you that this was obviously in part of the intention of Groundhog Day for Harold Ramis. And you can see even the radio song that is played at 6 a.m. every morning. If you listen to the lyrics of the song, it's "So put your little hand in mine, because there ain't no mountain we can't climb." Right. What's Sisyphus doing? He's climbing a mountain. So this was obviously in the mind of Harold Ramis. This was the intention. This is an analogy of Sisyphus. This is a retelling of Sisyphus. And so Phil is an absurdist hero in the Camus sense. And so let's look at this weather metaphor. So we cannot make the weather, right? The weather is the environment which we as humans must live with. It's the circumstances. We don't create the circumstances. Yet Phil, the weatherman, cannot accept this. He tries to control his reality. He lives with a sense of angst, resent, and melancholy at everything he can't control. Right? He says he makes the weather, right? But he can't. And he can't accept that. He's assigned to go to Punxsutawney, for example, and resents every moment of it instead of embracing the circumstances that he's in. Everything in Phil's world as a weatherman in Pittsburgh is essentially fake. He stands in front of a blue screen and puts on a fake persona to the camera. And then they cross the bridge into the other world. And at first, the town to Phil is anathema. He recontextualizes his situation several times. It shows that, look how many times he recontextualizes it. And we'll get into that with the stages later on, but it really shows that our reality is not good nor bad in itself, but only so through our eyes. Nothing has changed about the day, about the circumstances that Phil wakes up in every day. Nothing changes in his circumstances. Literally, it's exactly the same. Yet, he changes. And so, because he changes, everything changes. It's like that old Native American parable, if you've heard it. So there are two men arguing. One man says, "The tree is moving." The other man says, No, the wind is moving. And then the old wise man overhears, laughs, says, "You're both wrong. It's your minds that are moving." Only consciousness changes, right? Reframing, back to this concept of reframing. How could you reframe the day that you are living today? Because the circumstances are as they are, but you have the choice of how to look at it, right? As Rita says, it just depends how you look at it. Notice that there is no inherent meaning in the chair that you are sitting in or in the clothes that you are wearing. There is no meaning in that. You have ascribed meaning to those objects. And to a bird, those objects have no meaning. The same with a day. We walk around and we say, "Oh, this is a good day today," or "I'm having a bad day." But in reality, that's all in your mind, all in the frame that you have created. I'm not saying just accept a rubbish day, okay, and don't try and change it. That's not what I'm saying at all. But I am saying that your perspective creates your reality, that you create meaning, that you create purpose. And so when Phil is at the bowling place with those slovenly guys, and one of them says something like, some guys would say this is a glass half full. Some guys would say it's half empty. I bet you is a half empty kind of guy, am I right? You remember that part? Well, that alludes to this idea, right? And then Phil asks them, what would you do if you woke up every day and every day was the same and nothing you ever did mattered? And the other guy says, that about sums it up for me, right? Because nothing does matter in their life. That's how they choose to see their life. They choose to have a life void of meaning. But they create their own meaning. You create your own meaning. Phil asks, what would you do if there were no tomorrow? In the car, he asks that. And they do a little swivel. And they say, we could do whatever we want, right? And this is a perspective. So, again, back to this quote that Rita says, maybe it's not a curse. It just depends how you look at it. Let me ask you a couple of questions. So, first question. Choose the worst day you've had in the last year. Okay, think about it for a second. What's the worst day you've had in your last year? Now, if you got that day over and over and over again, could you learn to reframe it? What would it take for you to reframe that day? And second question, what could you choose to see differently today that would change your life now? What could you choose to see differently today that would change your life now? An objection that I've heard is that it would be impossible for Phil to ever be happy when everything he does always gets destroyed. Just like all the work Sisyphus does, right? It's true that Phil is not having any impact on his world through his actions, day by day by day. He's not having any impact, right? So some people might say, that's depressing. But he is having an impact on himself. His actions are not focused on being a means to an end, but as ends in themselves. That's how he transcends the day, right? And so that actually comes from a Kantian principle, right? The philosopher Immanuel Kant said that we should act in a way that you always treat humans as ends in themselves, not as a means to an end. The value in humanity is the end in itself, right? The value comes in humanity in the present moment. Humans are not a means to an end. They are ends in themselves, and so is each action. And I think it can be very powerful to dwell on that. Instead of always acting in the hope that your actions will lead to something, right? The practice of simply acting because the action emanates from who you are and acting because it is good in itself. This is powerful, and this gives us more peace as human beings. And by the way, all the impact you ever make on everyone else is going to be destroyed eventually anyway. In this physical realm of the universe, in this material realm, it will all be reset, right? In 1,000,000 years, chances are that none of what you did materially will matter anymore, right? Conventionally speaking, within our material universe, no one will remember you. Any invention that you make will already be destroyed. All the culture that you existed in will have long since vanished from existence. All this is, for Phil, simply a quickening of that. It's simply a tightening of that little rubber band, okay? So, get used to it. What does matter, though, is the impact that Phil has on himself. And what does matter for you is the impact that you have on yourself, and going back to the Kantian principle, that you act in a way that is an end in itself and not a means to an end. Because as long as you're looking ahead, projecting ahead, saying all of what I do is going to matter one day or eventually, yeah, maybe it will. And that would be great if eventually it will lead to something magnificent. But then that magnificent thing will also one day be destroyed in this material world. So, perhaps what you do is adding to some spiritual universal library that is outside of the material world, and okay, that's great. That's possible. But materially, don't get too caught up, right? So Phil evolves into someone who does not act only from ego, but rather transcends into someone with self-determined responsibilities. Someone who has become responsible in his reality, regardless of whether or not he must be so or not. He is so because he has grown up. We know he started out with a huge ego. Rita even said, I know you're egotistic. It's your defining characteristic. She said that for us, right? He transcends the cycle of life, not just when he becomes selfless in the hope of trying to avert calamity, right? Death or suffering, but when each solitary act becomes purposeful in itself and not a means to an end. So the final question, I'm going to have to end this podcast halfway through. We're going to have to do a part 2 because it's much longer than I thought. So, I'll get the hang of it, I'm sure. But the final question in this podcast, and I want you to return for the next podcast because it's about the shadow, and you have to get that. You have to get that to understand everything else. The final question I would ask you is, if you treated every day as an end in itself, right? Today is an end in itself, and what you do is an end in itself, and not a means to an end. How would you live differently? Really contemplate that. If you change your life so that everything you did was valuable and meaningful, because you create the meaning. You create the purpose of your life. Just like you create the purpose of a day, the purpose of an object we call a chair. There's no external purpose of your life, right? You create that. It's a perspective that you have power over. If you were to live your life based on purpose in an act itself, rather than acting as a means to an end, how would that change your life? And what would be the purpose that you create for yourself? Write it down now. But remember, please do remember that you need to listen to the second part of this podcast on Groundhog Day in order for you to refine that purpose. Because without the shadow work, you could make some really bad mistakes. All right? So I want to help you with that in part 2 of the podcast. And I'll get better at timing this thing. So please do that work. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please leave me a positive review on iTunes and wherever else you are listening to this. It really will help the podcast grow, and it will help me to reach a lot of other people who may really benefit from this. I might even read out your review on the show. Subscribe to the YouTube channel, Gabriel Sean Wallace. Check out the website, of course. If you're interested in getting one-to-one identity coaching with me, where you would get a completely personalized service and my full attention for 3 months of one-to-one coaching sessions via Skype or Zoom or WeChat, you can find out more about that on my website too. Have a great day wherever and whenever and whoever you are, and keep growing into you.